There is a dangerous mistake arrogant people make when they mistake a person's silence for weakness. They assume that because you do not shout, you do not have teeth. They assume that because you choose peace over petty arguments, you lack the power to dismantle their entire world with a single signature. My name is Hannah. For 8 years, I was the quiet daughter-in-law in the Harrington family. When my husband Richard's mother, Eleanor, made passive-aggressive remarks about my background as a forensic tax auditor, I simply smiled and sipped my tea. When his golden child younger sister, Chloe, demanded that I help fund her luxury lifestyle, I politely declined and let them call me selfish behind my back. I let them talk because my father, a retired probate judge in Cook County, gave me one piece of advice that guided every financial decision of my adult life. He told me to never interrupt an enemy while they are digging their own grave, and to simply make sure I own the land they are standing on. Last Saturday was the annual Harrington family reunion at the historic Manor House in Lake Forest. This 5,000 square foot estate was the crown jewel property Eleanor had bragged about hosting for 30 years. It was her identity, her pride, and the centerpiece of her social, standing among the country club elite. When I arrived with Richard and our 7-year-old daughter, Lily, Eleanor was standing on the grand front porch holding a glass of white wine. She did not welcome us with a hug. She did not even look at Lily. Instead, she pointed a manicured finger toward the detached, unheated garage behind the garden. Eleanor announced loud enough for 30 relatives to hear that the main house bedrooms were strictly reserved for legitimate Harrington bloodlines. She told me that Lily and I could set up sleeping bags on the concrete floor in the garage bay next to the lawnmower. She added that Lily was to stay out of the formal family portraits scheduled for the next afternoon. Richard looked down at his leather loafers and muttered that I should just go along with it because his mother had been dealing with a lot of stress. I looked down at my daughter. Lily was clutching her small stuffed rabbit, her lower lip trembling as she tried not to cry in front of her cousins. Then I looked at Eleanor, whose face carried a look of triumphant superiority. I did not yell. I did not shed a single tear. I did not give Eleanor the satisfaction of seeing me lose my composure. Instead, I took Lily by the hand, walked back to my car, opened the glove compartment, and retrieved a certified blue legal folder. What Eleanor had conveniently forgotten was that 4 years ago, when her late husband's reckless private debts brought this entire manor within 3 days of a public county foreclosure auction, it was not the Harrington family that saved it. It was my private trust that purchased the mortgage in full cash. I picked up my phone, dialed the Lake County Sheriff non-emergency line, and requested a scheduled escort for the following afternoon. To understand how Eleanor Harrington ended up standing on a porch she did not own, you have to understand the fragile illusion of old money in Lake Forest. To the outside world, the Harringtons were an institution. They had the 4-car garage, the sculpted boxwood hedges, the private tennis memberships, and the oil portraits of great-grandfathers lining the grand foyer. Eleanor wore that heritage like armor. She spent her days attending charity galas, organizing bridge tournaments, and speaking about the Harrington legacy as if it were royalty. But armor is completely hollow inside. 4 years ago, my late father-in-law, Charles Harrington, passed away suddenly from a heart attack. He was a charming man who spent 4 decades maintaining a lifestyle he could never truly afford. When the estate attorneys opened his safe deposit boxes, they did not find generational wealth. They found a mountain of unpaid contractor invoices, 2 defaulted personal lines of credit, and a second mortgage with an immediate balloon payment of $640,000 on the Lake Forest Manor. The bank was 30 days away from posting a public auction notice on the front gate. Eleanor was hysterical, not over the loss of her husband, but over the sheer terror of public humiliation. She could not bear the thought of her social circle finding out that the Grand Harrington family was financially ruined. My husband Richard came to me in the middle of the night. He sat at our kitchen table with his head in his hands, weeping uncontrollably. He begged me to help his mother save the house. He told me that losing the property would literally kill Eleanor. As a senior forensic tax auditor, I do not operate on emotion or family guilt. I operate on cold, verifiable ledgers and binding legal protections. I was well aware that Eleanor had treated me like an unwanted outsider from the day Richard brought me home. During our first Thanksgiving dinner, she asked me in front of 12 guests if my father's municipal salary was enough to afford decent silverware. When Richard and I bought our first home, she called it a starter shack in an unrefined neighborhood. Yet, for the sake of my husband and my daughter, I agreed to intervene. However, I made it very clear to Richard that I would not give Eleanor a blank check to continue her reckless lifestyle. I established a private corporate entity called Aegis Real Estate Holdings. Working directly with my attorney, Marcus Vance, Aegis approached the private lender and purchased the defaulted mortgage note at a negotiated cash settlement. In addition, Aegis paid off the $78,000 in delinquent county property taxes and assumed the title through an irrevocable land trust. Under the terms of the settlement, Eleanor was granted a revocable occupancy license. This agreement allowed her to continue living in the manor rent-free as a guest of the trust, provided she met three specific conditions. First, she was responsible for basic interior utility bills. Second, she was strictly forbidden from subleasing, altering, or attempting to encumber the property. Third, she had to execute an annual legal acknowledgement confirming that she held zero equity and zero ownership in the real estate. Eleanor was so desperate to preserve her public image that she signed every single document in Marcus's office without reading the underlying clauses. She saw the foreclosure stopped, she saw the bank walk away, and she chose to believe that Richard's tech salary had somehow resolved the problem. For 4 full years, I let Eleanor live in that comfortable fantasy. I quietly covered the $3,400 monthly property taxes, the structural maintenance, the roof replacements, and the comprehensive liability insurance out of my own consulting revenue. I never threw it in her face. I never demanded gratitude. I never asked for an apology for the endless passive-aggressive insults she threw my way during holiday dinners. All I demanded in return was basic human decency under a roof paid for by my hard work. But entitlement is a disease that blinds people to reality. When Eleanor pointed her finger at my 7-year-old daughter and told her she belonged on a cold concrete floor next to a lawnmower, she permanently terminated the grace period I had granted her family. After leaving the driveway, I did not waste time arguing with Richard. When he grabbed my arm and pleaded with me not to create a scene in front of his aunts and cousins, I gently pulled my arm away. I told him in a calm voice that I was taking our daughter to dinner. I did not unpack our luggage. I buckled Lily into the back seat of my car, turned out of the long gravel drive, and drove straight to downtown Chicago. I checked into a spacious corner suite at the Four Seasons overlooking Lake Michigan. I ordered room service with warm soup and fresh fruit for Lily, and let her fall asleep in a warm bed surrounded by clean linens and complete peace. While my daughter slept, I sat at the suite desk with my laptop and opened the secure digital files of Aegis Holdings. Between 8 o'clock in the evening and midnight, my phone vibrated constantly with incoming calls and messages. First came the texts from Richard. He accused me of being dramatic and oversensitive. He said that Eleanor had already coordinated the morning catering schedule and expected me to prepare the fruit platters and breakfast quiches for 15 guests by 7 in the morning. He claimed that my absence was making him look bad in front of his entire family. Then came a voicemail from Eleanor. Her tone was sharp, icy, and full of condescending authority. She said that my childish behavior was unacceptable. She warned me that over 60 prominent guests were attending Chloe's formal engagement party the following afternoon, and that if I failed to show up on time to manage the kitchen staff, Richard would be having a serious conversation about the future of our marriage. I listened to the voicemail once, saved the digital recording to an external drive, and closed the laptop. I did not send a single text. I did not return a single phone call. The next morning, I woke up early and took Lily down to the hotel terrace for breakfast. We spent the morning walking through the botanical gardens and enjoying the sunshine. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, I helped Lily dress in a clean summer dress while I put on a tailored navy dress, styled my hair neatly, and placed the original certified deed documents into my leather briefcase. At 2:15 in the afternoon, I turned the car back onto the tree-lined avenue leading toward the Harrington Manor. The private gravel drive was completely packed with luxury sedans and catering trucks. On the expansive back lawn, a massive white marquee tent was surrounded by 60 guests in formal summer attire, holding crystal champagne glasses and listening to a live classical quartet. Eleanor was standing on the elevated stone patio in an ivory lace dress, surrounded by her country club friends and golden child daughter Chloe. Chloe was laughing loudly, showing off a large diamond engagement ring to several admiring relatives. As I walked up the stone steps toward the patio with my briefcase in hand, the background conversation began to fade. Eleanor turned around, lowered her sunglasses, and stared at me with open disdain. Eleanor announced to the surrounding circle that the stubborn daughter-in-law had finally decided to arrive just in time to help the waitstaff clear the empty glasses. Richard hurried over to me, his face pale with stress, whispering that his mother was about to make the most important announcement of the decade and that I needed to stand quietly in the back. I looked at my husband, then looked at Eleanor's triumphant expression, and told them both that I was looking forward to hearing every single word. The sun reached its peak over the manicured gardens, casting sharp shadows across the limestone terrace. Eleanor stepped up to the center of the stone platform, tapped her crystal champagne glass with a silver cocktail spoon, and waited for the crowd of 60 people to fall completely silent. Beside her stood Chloe, radiant in a tailored designer summer dress, and Chloe's fiancé, Preston. Preston came from a prominent family in the private equity sector, and his parents were standing in the front row of guests, looking around the expansive grounds with approving nods. To them, this manor was living proof of the Harrington family's enduring pedigree and financial power. Eleanor took a deep breath, looked around the gathering with tears of theatrical joy in her eyes, and raised her voice so that every guest, caterer, and family member could hear her clearly. She began by speaking about the importance of legacy, heritage, and the unbroken chain of the Harrington name. She talked about how her late husband, Charles, had built this estate to stand as an eternal monument to their family's success. She said that a true family does not allow its wealth to scatter into the hands of outsiders, but rather passes its greatest treasures down to those who carry the true bloodline. Then came the moment she had planned for weeks. Eleanor turned toward Chloe and Preston, took their hands, and announced that as a grand engagement gift, she was formally deeding the entire 5,000-square-foot Harrington Manor to the young couple. The entire terrace erupted into thunderous applause. Chloe gasped with delight, throwing her arms around her mother's neck. Preston's parents smiled proudly, shaking hands with nearby guests. The hired photographer moved forward, snapping dozens of photos of Eleanor, wiping her eyes while Chloe flashed her 3-carat diamond ring against the backdrop of the grand manor house. Richard was standing right beside me. He let out a long sigh of relief, clapped his hands together, and leaned toward my ear. He whispered that his mother was finally securing the family's future, and that Chloe and Preston were going to turn the estate into a centerpiece for high society entertaining. I stood completely still, holding my small glass of sparkling water, and watched the entire performance unfold without moving a muscle. Eleanor held up both hands to quiet the applause. Her expression shifted from joyful maternal pride to a sharp, calculating focus. She turned her gaze slowly across the lawn, deliberately passing over dozens of smiling faces until her eyes locked directly onto me. Eleanor announced into the microphone that maintaining such a magnificent generational property required shared responsibility. She smiled warmly at the crowd, her tone dripping with polished condescension, and said that while bloodlines preserve the heritage, marriage brings an obligation to contribute. She looked straight into my eyes and told the entire 60-person gathering that her quiet daughter-in-law, Hannah, had generously agreed to make a special contribution to the new couple. Eleanor declared that I had committed $50,000 from my personal savings account to fund the complete renovation of the master bridal suite before the wedding in the spring. A wave of polite murmuring rippled through the guests. Several older women in Eleanor's bridge club turned around in their chairs, looking at me with nods of polite approval. Eleanor was deliberately using the social pressure of 60 influential people to corner me. She believed that because we were standing in front of Preston's wealthy family and the town's elite, I would be forced to smile, nod, and write a check simply to avoid a public scene. In her mind, the quiet bookkeeper's daughter would never dare to speak up and destroy the polite atmosphere of a Lake Forest garden party. Richard gripped my right wrist tightly. His knuckles turned white, and his breath came in short, nervous gasps. He leaned in close and hissed through his teeth that I needed to nod immediately. He told me to just agree to the $50,000 and that we could figure out our personal budget later. He begged me not to humiliate his family in front of Preston's parents. I looked down at Richard's fingers digging into my wrist. For 8 years, this was the dynamic that defined our marriage. Whenever Eleanor demanded money, attention, or subservience, Richard expected me to absorb the blow and remain quiet. Whenever Eleanor threw an insult or made a financial demand, Richard expected me to sacrifice my own dignity just to keep the peace. I gently pulled my wrist away from his grip. I took 2 steps forward onto the limestone landing, set my glass down on a nearby side table, and turned to face Eleanor and the entire assembly of 60 guests. I spoke in a steady, clear voice that carried effortlessly through the afternoon air. I told Eleanor that there appeared to be a significant clerical misunderstanding in her speech. Eleanor let out a sharp, dismissive laugh. She turned to the crowd, raised her eyebrows theatrically, and remarked that the bookkeeper's daughter was getting confused by numbers again. She told me that if $50,000 was too steep for my modest budget, I could simply say so privately rather than interrupting a formal celebration. I told Eleanor that the issue was not about the $50,000. The issue was about basic property law. I told her plainly that she could not gift a $5 million estate to Chloe and Preston because she had not owned a single square foot of the property for 4 years. A heavy, breathless silence fell over the lawn. The string quartet stopped playing in the middle of a measure. Chloe's smile vanished instantly. Preston's parents lowered their champagne glasses and exchanged sharp, questioning looks. Eleanor's face flushed a deep, mottled red. She stepped down from the wooden riser, trembling with rage, and hissed that I was an ungrateful, hysterical outsider. She commanded Richard to take his wife by the arm and throw me off the estate grounds before she had the country club security called to remove me in handcuffs. Before Richard could take a single step, the sound of gravel crunching under heavy tires echoed from the front driveway. 2 Lake County Sheriff vehicles pulled into the circular motor court, followed by a dark town car. The engines went quiet, and 2 uniformed sheriff deputies stepped out onto the gravel, accompanied by my lead corporate attorney, Marcus Vance. Marcus was carrying a thick leather binder filled with certified court exhibits. Eleanor puffed up her chest, smoothed her ivory lace dress, and marched down the stone steps toward the driveway. She called out to the deputies, demanding that they immediately remove an unruly trespasser who was causing a public disturbance at a private family engagement party. The senior deputy glanced at his official clipboard, looked past Eleanor completely, and walked straight toward the stone terrace where I was standing. The deputy tipped his hat politely and addressed me as Mrs. Hannah Harrington. He confirmed that his department had received the certified chancery court filings submitted that morning by Aegis Real Estate Holdings, and that they were present to oversee the formal service of process and ensure the preservation of trust property. Eleanor let out a breathless, mocking gasp. She shouted that this was an outrage, that she was Eleanor Harrington, and that her late husband Charles had purchased the land in 1988. Marcus Vance stepped forward into the center of the terrace, opened his leather portfolio, and pulled out 3 sets of certified, stamped legal documents. He addressed Eleanor in a calm, precise tone that echoed across the entire manicured lawn. Marcus explained that 4 years ago, the estate had entered default under county foreclosure proceedings due to extensive unpaid personal debts. He stated that Aegis Real Estate Holdings had purchased the underlying promissory note, cleared the $78,000 in delinquent county property taxes, and assumed full title to the deed. Marcus explained that Eleanor had been granted a strictly conditional revocable occupancy license, allowing her to stay on the property as a guest of the land trust. That license required 0 unauthorized attempts to encumber, lease, or transfer the real estate, and strictly prohibited the unlawful exclusion of the legal title holder. Marcus turned slightly toward the 60 guests, who were now standing completely frozen in place. He stated that attempting to publicly convey title to a third party constituted an immediate material breach of contract. Furthermore, Eleanor's written and verbal demand the previous day requiring the managing member of Aegis Holdings and her 7-year-old child to occupy an unheated detached tool shed constituted an unlawful constructive eviction. Marcus handed the blue folders directly to Eleanor. He informed her that her occupancy license was officially revoked, and that she was being served with a formal 30-day notice to vacate the premises. The quiet that settled over the garden was absolute. Chloe dropped her crystal champagne glass onto the flagstones, where it shattered into dozens of pieces. Preston stepped back from Chloe, quietly letting go of her hand as he read the bold lettering on the legal summons. Preston's parents quietly excused themselves, gathered their jackets, and began walking toward their car without saying a single word to Eleanor. Eleanor's hands shook uncontrollably as she looked down at the signature line on the recorded county deed. There, stamped in certified blue ink, was the full name of the sole managing member and property owner, Hannah Vance Harrington. Eleanor looked up, the color draining completely from her face. Her voice cracked into a whisper as she asked how I could do this to her family. I stepped down from the landing until I was standing directly in front of Eleanor and Richard. I spoke softly, ensuring my words were calm and measured. I reminded Eleanor that 4 years ago, I saved her family from public bankruptcy and absolute ruin out of love for my husband. For 4 full years, I paid every dollar of property taxes, structural repairs, and insurance while she treated me like cheap help and mocked my upbringing in front of her friends. I told Eleanor that when she looked at my 7-year-old daughter and told her she belonged on a concrete floor next to a lawnmower, she made a critical error in judgment. She assumed that kindness was a sign of weakness and that silence meant surrender. I looked at Richard, whose face was completely pale with disbelief and shame. He tried to reach for my hand, stammering apologies and begging me to call Marcus off so we could discuss things as a family inside the house. I gently stepped out of his reach. I told Richard that for 8 years, I had stood by him while he allowed his mother to chip away at my self-respect. But the moment he allowed Eleanor to target our daughter, our marriage was over. I did not stay to watch the caterers pack away the untouched whore's d'oeuvres. I did not stay to hear Eleanor's hysterical weeping as the reality of her eviction set in. I walked calmly to my car, got into the driver's seat, and drove back to Chicago to pick up Lily from the hotel. Over the next 30 days, Eleanor was forced to pack 4 decades of accumulated possessions into moving boxes under the direct supervision of the county sheriff. Without the Harrington Manor to support her social standing, her bridge club invitations evaporated overnight. Chloe and Preston called off their engagement 3 weeks later, when Preston's family realized that the promised multi-million-dollar dowry was nothing more than an empty illusion. Aegis Real Estate Holdings placed Harrington Manor on the open market 2 months later. The property sold to a delightful young physician and his family for $3.4 million. Every cent of the net proceeds was placed into a protected, irrevocable trust fund dedicated entirely to Lily's education and future. Richard and I finalized our divorce through a quiet mediation. He received exactly what he had brought into the marriage, nothing more and nothing less. Today, Lily and I live in a warm, light-filled home near the lake. There are no grand marble pillars or fake family coats of arms, but there is laughter, dignity, and absolute peace in every room. Sometimes, people ask me if I regret staying silent for all those years while Eleanor tried to make me feel small. I always give them the exact same lesson my father taught me so many years ago. When you hold the deed to your own life, you never have to raise your voice. The truth always has a way of speaking for itself.